Join me tonight live on YouTube at 10:15 Eastern, where we will live stream the XFL. And now, on with our feature presentation. January 29th, 1975. It's 8 o'clock in the morning on the day of one of the biggest days of the entire season, Draft Day. This is the day where teams across the league try and better their rosters and fill all the holes on their team with young talent from the collegiate ranks. And this is the day where a lot of young men get to realize their dream and hear their name called, as they officially become members of the National Football League. So what was this guy right here, Minnesota Vikings head coach Bud Grant, doing at that time, just minutes before the draft was set to begin, and just minutes before the Vikings had just about their only chance to improve the roster, seeing as free agency did not exist back then? He was at home, assisting his wife in giving birth to some new puppies. Seriously. Remember the side plot in the movie Draft Day, where Sonny Weaver Jr. has to take care of some familial business just minutes before the draft? And how people criticized that for not being realistic, and for adding unnecessary drama to a movie that already had a ton of drama? Not so unrealistic, because Bud Grant was going through the exact same thing in 1975. As Grant said, "My lab, Sheila, was home giving birth. She had 2 pups at 8 o'clock in the morning, and the vet said we can expect 3 or 4 more before she's done." Grant continued, saying on assisting in the birth of some new puppies, "It was an exciting time. We haven't had a birth in the house in about 8 years. So you had 2 hours to go until the Vikings were officially on the clock, and Grant was at home because his dog was giving birth. And I bring up this story because it just about set the tone for the Vikings at the 1975 NFL Draft, in the sense that this draft was going to be anything but normal. Because somehow, that crazy story about Bud Grant and his dog giving birth right as the draft was about to start? Yeah, that's not even the craziest story involving Grant and the Vikings during the day of that draft. It was one of those days. Because when it came time to make their second round selection, and when it came time to bolster the roster that way, the Vikings went through an absolutely bizarre process. From skipping their pick entirely and letting the clock run out, to confusion with who they selected, this pick had it all, and we're breaking it down today. Because this is the story behind one of the craziest draft moments in the history of the Minnesota Vikings franchise, and perhaps the craziest draft moment in the legendary Hall of Fame career of head coach Bud Grant. Before I talk about the actual incident in question, we need some context to understand what the original game plan was with regards to how Grant conducted business during the draft, as well as the player in question that the Vikings were going to select. Every team, before making a selection, likes to do their due diligence, and I think that goes without saying. You want to make sure all your T's are crossed and all your I's are dotted before making a decision that's going to cost your team thousands of dollars, and before making a decision that could change the future of your franchise forever. But the Vikings like to take things one step further, and do their due diligence on the day of the draft, which led to them taking longer to make their selections than most teams. Before making their pick, the Vikings would go as far as calling up the prospect in question to talk to them and make sure that they were 100% healthy, and nothing freaky happened that they didn't know about. This seems like common practice today, but back in 1975, not so much. As Grant said on why he does this, "We always like to talk to the boy first. There's a lot at stake, so you want to be sure he hasn't just fallen off a horse or discovered he's got cancer. Who knows? Maybe he's in jail. You need to be sure everything is okay." That's exactly what the Vikings did with their first round selection, when they chose this guy right here, Mark Mullaney, a defensive lineman who played on the offensive line at Colorado State. Grant made sure to call him up before turning in the draft card, and even though Mullaney didn't pick up the phone, his girlfriend, Jody Nelson, did, and Nelson assured Grant that everything was fine. That pick turned out pretty good for the Vikings, as Mullaney played 12 seasons in Minnesota, recorded 41.5 sacks, and started 97 games for the team. And now, after taking Mullaney in the first round, it was time for the Vikings to bolster up their defensive line even more with their second-round pick. And Bud Grant and company were eyeing this man right here from USC, a defensive lineman wearing the number 70 jersey by the name of Art Riley. Riley was one of the most feared defensive linemen in the entire country, and especially in the Pac-8. He was named to the All-Pac-8 team in 1974, and he was a big reason why USC finished the season with a 10-1-1 record, a Rose Bowl win, and the 12th best defense in the nation by allowing just 11.8 points per game. He was anchoring a stout defensive line, and head coach John McKay was not shy with his praise for Riley, saying on him and eventual NFL player Gary Jeter, "We have two of the best defensive tackles in the country." That's pretty high praise, and I can't say it wasn't undeserved by any means. And if that wasn't enough, McKay doubled down on that praise after a 34-10 win by USC over Stanford, where Riley had 7 tackles and won Defensive Player of the Week honors, when he said, "I said before the season that Riley could be one of the best defensive tackles in the country, and he has done nothing to disappoint me." Bottom line, Art Riley was really, really good, and it was a matter of when, not if, he was going to get drafted into the NFL. Now, why did the Vikings look at Art Riley, aside from the fact that he was a really good college player and was an anchor on USC's defensive line? Even though the Purple People Eaters had a solid defensive line and made it to the Super Bowl thanks to the third best defense in football, there was still room for improvement, especially since they were below the league-wide average in sacks, and especially after they got gashed for 249 rushing yards in Super Bowl IX and allowed Franco Harris to run wild over them, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Bud Grant was always a believer of building through the trenches, addressing the lines before anything else, and he saw no reason to change that philosophy here, especially with Riley on the board. Plus, Minnesota's defensive line was not getting any younger, and they needed reinforcements quickly. Of the 7 defensive linemen on the Vikings in 1974, their average age going into the 1975 season was over 31 years old. Carl Eller was going to be 33, Bob Lordsema was going to be 33, Gary Larson was going to be 35, and Jim Marshall was going to be 38. And the only reason their average age was as low as 31 was because it was weighed down by a 23-year-old rookie in Dave Boone, who barely suited up for the team. Take him out of the equation and just focus on the guys to play at least 50% of the team's games, and the average age of the defensive lineman was just a hair under 33 years old. So it made complete sense as to why the Vikings were looking at a guy like Riley. Their defensive line was aging, and Riley could be a great addition for the future as guys start to retire and decline due to their age. With that, when it was time for the Vikings to formally make their draft pick, and when it was time for the Vikings to select in the second round of the draft, they were eyeing Art Riley. So Bud Grant and the team went through their standard operating procedure. They called up Riley and wanted to make sure that everything was fine, and nothing crazy happened overnight, like him going to the hospital or getting arrested or falling off the face of the earth. Except, there was just one small problem when they called him up. Nobody picked up. The Vikings were unable to reach Riley, or anyone in his party for that matter. No friend picked up the phone, no family member picked up the phone, nothing. There was nothing on the other side. And that's when Bud Grant and the Vikings had a decision to make, because it seemed like they had 2 options. Do we take Riley and ignore the procedure and just hope that everything is okay? Or do we take someone else that we have on our board that we know their whereabouts? You would think that these were the only 2 options that the Vikings had available to them. But instead, they decided to do a third, almost laughable option. They intentionally ran out of time. They let the Pittsburgh Steelers leapfrog them, potentially risking that they would take Riley, and potentially risking that other teams could take Riley, just so that they could try and do their due diligence and get that phone call in. This would be the last time that the Vikings ever ran out of time when trying to make their draft pick. Pittsburgh didn't do much of anything with the pick that was gifted to them by the Vikings, as they took Grambling State defensive end Bob Barber, who would play 4 seasons in the NFL and record 13.5 sacks. However, none of those games and none of those sacks came with the Steelers, as he spent his entire career with the Green Bay Packers. But after the Steelers made their pick, the Vikings, hoping that the extended time would allow them to locate Art Riley, were still out of luck. Every time they called, they got absolutely nothing. And at this point, Grant and company took the chance. They said, screw the phone call, screw the procedure. We're drafting Riley and hoping for the best. After letting the Steelers leapfrog them in the draft order, and after unsuccessful attempt to try and contact the man of the hour, they drafted him anyways. And that leaves 2 questions left to answer. Obviously, we have to know how Art Riley played in his NFL career, and whether this was all worth the hassle and all the extra drama and the breaking of their own procedure. But first, why was there no answer? Turns out, Riley changed his phone number before the draft and never let the Vikings know about it. As Riley said, "I guess that was my fault. I've changed my number about 3 times in the last 3 weeks because so many agents have been bugging me. I guess Minnesota didn't have my new number, and man, that was killing me. I sat in my room all day waiting for the phone to ring. The silence was awful. No wonder the phone didn't ring. No one knew how to contact him. Surely there had to be a better way to go about this besides leaving the NFL teams in the dark and unable to reach you. By changing his phone number and not letting anyone, not even other teams, know about it, not only does it defeat the purpose of having a phone number and being able to be contacted, but it sent the Vikings into a loop where they panicked and had no idea what they were doing, even so much as running out of time with their selection. And unfortunately for Riley and the Vikings, this was a pretty good omen for how his NFL career would turn out. You would think that right around here, I would show highlights of Art Riley's career in the NFL and what he did, and how he did. However, there are none. Because all the way around, the 1975 draft class for the Vikings was a massive whiff outside of Mulaney, and perhaps no whiff was bigger than Art Riley, who never even so much as played a single down in the NFL. Riley underwent knee surgery 3 months later, and was unable to bounce back from that at an effective level, as Riley was cut by the Vikings following the end of the preseason. The defensive tackle taken right before Riley was Doug English, a very good player for the Detroit Lions who played until 1985, made 4 Pro Bowls, and was named an AP First-Team All-Pro once and a Second-Team All-Pro 3 times. The defensive tackle taken right after Riley was Dave Pear, who played 6 seasons and made the Pro Bowl in 1978 with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers following a 9-sack season. And sandwiched in between the two was Art Riley, who didn't play a down in the NFL and was a massive bust. Safe to say, the Vikings' gamble to break their own procedure did not pay off at all. So just to recap this insanely crazy day for Bud Grant and company. Minutes before the draft begins, he's at home assisting his wife in the process of giving birth to some new puppies. Then he tries calling up a draft prospect, but the prospect never gives him his number, and the Vikings panic so much that they run out of time with their selection, letting the Steelers overtake them, before finally saying, screw it, and just taking him anyway. And as it turned out, the guy needed surgery and wouldn't play it down in the NFL. If that's not chaos, then I don't know what is. Because on this day in 1975, call the Vikings the anti-Rob Thomas, because their draft day was anything but smooth. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.